Good afternoon, everyone. Depending on where you're joining us from, good morning or good evening. I'm thrilled to have you all join us for this presentation. This is KYC challenges and opportunities looking ahead at 2021, and very pleased and privileged to have a panel of real experts join us here today. Before we get to that, I am going to briefly introduce the session, give you a few notes on logistics, and then turn it over to our moderator, John O'Neill, to really take it away from here. So mercifully, you won't hear me talk that much on this session, which is probably a break for everyone. So for those that aren't familiar with me, I am Brian Zbodekindle with the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists. And for those that aren't familiar with us, we are a professional association that exists to serve you, the community of financial crime detection and prevention professionals, regardless of your role. Obviously, today we're focusing on KYC, but we have folks out there in the association and on the line in a lot of different roles, a lot of different departments, fraud prevention professionals, AML, EDD, even folks out there in cyber roles or vendor due diligence or the government sector, law enforcement. So we are the big tent of financial crime, risk management, detection, and prevention. We cover all these issues more, and we do that through membership, through our offerings around webinars, which is included in membership, access to our webinar archives, news and analysis, and much more for members. We offer online training, and we offer the Certified Financial Crime Specialist, or CFCS, credential as well. Really the only credential out there that covers the full spectrum of financial crime risk. So if you're not familiar with us and who we are, what we do, I urge you to visit our website, acfcs.org, learn more about everything we have to offer. We also have an event coming up next week. Silent 8, who was kind enough to be hosting this session here today, will be part of that event as well. And that is the Back to the Future of Financial Crime Summit. And that, much like today, will be looking back at a really singular year, 2020. I'm sure we're glad to have that year behind us, but there's a lot to learn from it, a lot of lessons to take forward. So we're going to be looking back at 2020, talking about key lessons in the financial crime space, and then looking ahead to 2021 and seeing what's going to be continuing into the future, trends, disruption, technology impacts, and much more. So again, visit our website, www.acfcs.org, or the FinCrime event site, fincrimeevent.com. We made it easy on you to remember it. Entirely complimentary, and definitely urge you to check that out and register today. That's going to be running the 26th to the 29th, 4 days of learning, networking, and some great sessions lined up. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's get into a great session here today. This is a browser-based webinar platform. In case you have any issues with audio, visual, video cuts out, that type of thing. First step, refresh your browser. That's usually takes care of most of the problems. If issues persist, it might be a resource or bandwidth issue. Try closing out your browser tabs. If you're like me, you'll have like 20 of them open at a time, and they're draining your browser. So try closing those out. If you're still having problems, you can close your browser, rejoin the presentation, and Chrome or Firefox are generally going to give you the best results. So check those out. If you're not currently if you're using Safari or Edge or whatever, and you have the option to change, try that. All right, poll questions. We're going to be doing several poll questions during this session. Please do take a minute to respond to those. You should be seeing one in your slide window right in the middle of your screen, or depending on how you have your windows set up, you can actually move them around. You might have moved it over. But in any case, it should be there right now. Go ahead, select your answer, and hit that submit button, and we'll look at the results in just a second while I just talk through a couple more things. This session is being recorded. Will be posted to the ACFCS site within 3 business days of this presentation. You will receive an email when that is available. If you're an ACFCS member, you'll be able to access the recording and a version of the slides. Please opt in to receive slides, additional resources associated with this presentation. There'll be a poll question a little bit later, and if you opt in, we'll be able to send you some resources around this session. So I'll put that up a little bit later. Go ahead and choose yes in that poll question, and we'll be able to follow up with you. But if you're a member, you'll automatically have access on the site to the recording, a version of the slide deck, and additional resources. You'll also be able to get your certificate of participation if you're a member within 3 business days of this session. Please please ask questions. I see we have questions already coming in, which is great. You'll see a Q&A text box on the left-hand, I believe the left-hand side of your screen. Sometimes it moves around. But wherever it is, type your questions in, and we'll be able to field questions potentially throughout the session. If not, definitely going to be saving time for dedicated Q&A towards the end of the session. And finally, please do fill out the survey at the end of this presentation. Let us know your thoughts and feedback and suggest topics for future presentations. It really helps us tailor the content that you most want to see. So choose the poll question now or forever hold your peace on this one. And it looks like about 73% are from banks. Other is about 15%, and then a little smattering here and there of everybody else. So that's great. I think that's very pertinent to the audience. Are very pertinent to the panel we have lined up here today, and I think we'll have a lot to talk about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John O'Neill with Silent 8. John's been on a couple webinars with us in the past, so the big fans, ACFCS webinar fans out there will probably recognize him, and a really fantastic moderator. Thrilled to have him back, and thanks again to Silent 8 for putting this on. So with that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you and get us started. Thanks again.
Thank you, Brian. You cut out for a little bit there. I'm assuming we're underway. Thanks a ton for the invite. We are thrilled to be back after our first ACFCS panel, the case for ongoing KYC, back on October 21st. I am John O'Neill. I'm the Senior Vice President here at Silent 8 of Regional Sales, and I will be the moderator for this panel. For this one, we've assembled a team of highly experienced professionals who've really been battling financial crime on the front line for the past decade, and in a couple of cases, even longer than that. We have Ryan Lahir, the Vice President and Compliance Manager at M&T, Karen Jacobson, Assistant Vice President, BSA Officer at Wintrust, Corey Gedden, Senior Manager and KYC Compliance Advisor at Capital One, and Jennifer Demos, VP and Financial Crimes Officer at Wells Fargo. I do want to take a minute to just allow everybody on the panel to say a quick hello, get to know the sound of their voice, and tell you just a little bit about them. Ryan, let's start with you. And Ryan is joining us deep from the trenches in the fight against financial crime. I don't even think we have a webcam on for Ryan, but we can hear you just fine. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think my IT colleagues in Baltimore are getting a little payback from Saturday's loss. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending where you're calling from. Ryan Lahir, M&T Bank. I have been in the AML space since 2003, which is a long time. Currently, I manage a team of 3 professionals, and we review enhanced due diligence cases to determine if we want to retain or exit relationships.
Thank you, Ryan. Next up is Karen Jacobson.
Hi, everyone. This is Karen Jacobson. I am the Assistant Vice President for Wintrust Financial, BSA Officer for 3 of our charter banks. Wintrust is made up of 15 different community bank charters. And I also oversee a team of EDD specialists, 10 total, and we look at our high-risk customers and those customers that pose potential risk to the bank. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Karen. Next up, Mr. Corey Gedden.
Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here. I'm Corey Gedden. I'm a KYC compliance advisor for Capital One, where I lead a team of compliance professionals in administering our KYC program. So with that, we drive a lot of the standards and procedures from the second line perspective for the first line. And I have a little over 6 years of AML experience, where I've played multiple roles, whether it be from proactively building out a program, or risk management, or driving internal controls, or just looking at process excellence. So I'm very happy to be here, very excited for the conversation that we'll have today.
Fantastic. And last but by absolutely no means least, we have Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer. As you heard, I am with Wells Fargo Bank as a financial crimes officer. I've functioned as a go-between between the financial crimes division of Wells Fargo and the regulators. So I've been on the front line of some of those conversations regarding KYC financial crimes in general. Right now, I'm on the front line with a segment of the Wells Fargo customer base, integrating compliance regulations and requirements for that customer base. And so I'm very happy to be here. I come from Tampa, Florida, and I have a husband and 2 middle school children. So pray for me, think of me. And I have a dog, a Boston Terrier named Coco. Pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you. At some point, I think we're going to have all our panelists join with their pets. I know my cats are always anxious to leap in and join every panel I've ever been on. So with that, I want to sort of leap right into it. Our topic today is Compliance Insiders Speak, KYC challenges and opportunities ahead for 2021, and we've got a lot to talk about. We have the panelists and I have been bantering back and forth on this. We've with great effort, we've sort of narrowed it down to 4 topics. We're going to try to keep to about 8 minutes on each topic, and because we've got a lot to digest, I'm going to try hard to keep us on that. So we're going to be driving hard through these questions. The last 15 minutes of the panel, of course, are left for audience questions, always by far the liveliest session of the panel. So we're hopeful that you guys, as always, will be keeping us on our toes and sending in questions. Shayna on our team will be sort of sifting through them and feeding them to us the most interesting and challenging questions for me to pose to the panelists. With that, let's go ahead and dive right in with our first question. Every bank has their own risk policy with regards to what kinds of customers are too risky to bank. And that's helped, of course, protect financial institutions across the country from risks for decades. Our first question: what customers are too risky to onboard in 2021? Jennifer, let's start with you.
Okay, sounds good. Well, that is a loaded question, and we can consider that, but we want to be mindful that we don't just go to the extreme end of de-risking, because FATF has advised against that, obviously. But I think there's 5 key principles that we can think of. And the first being that customers whose identities that we can't properly verify. An example of this would be like a bearer share entity that is not registered, or we can't find, who the control prong of that entity is. Although there's fewer offshore jurisdictions which allow this, there are still some. And so that would be one. The second one, any customer that would participate in an illegal activity. Again, this is another hot bucket category, because the category of dispensaries fall into this, because, as we know, they may be legal on the state level but criminalized on the federal level. And so questions like where your bank charter is, what your risk tolerance of the bank has to be put into play, but that is just one consideration. If they participate in legal activities that may be too risky for your bank, that would be a call that you'd have to make. The third one is private individuals or legal entities that are sanctioned by sanctioned regime. That would be the third category. Kind of goes without any further explanation there. Or customers who, the fourth one, just blanket refuse to adhere to banks or financial institutions' AML policies and their requirements, or refuse to give you information and whatnot. And finally, the customers that are residing in high-risk countries or sanctioned countries like Iran or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea. Even with this category, though, I would urge the banks to consider the customer's primary residence in that equation, so that you don't fall into, mass exiting customers and potentially bring yourself under reputational scrutiny for that. But those are 5 categories that I can think of off the top.
Jennifer, that's a great answer. But I want to ask you a quick follow-up question. And you're right, it is a loaded question, but that's what keeps it interesting. So so let me ask you this, and you touched on this when you and I sort of talked about this a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Do regulators want banks to wholesale exit customers, or are they more interested in seeing, procedures and controls?
They are definitely more interested in seeing procedures and controls. Actually, they have said point blank that they do not want banks to blanket wholesale just de-risk. They reject that concept. For multiple reasons, but de-risking can introduce risk into the global financial system, because terminating relationships can force some of those entities into less regulated or unregulated channels. And so the banks are kind of the first line of defense for the government and for law enforcement. And so if we just de-risk them and leave them, they're going to go somewhere else to put their money and do their transactions. And so then there's less line of sight into them. So de-risking is not, as blanket de-risking, that's not preferable. Instead of, you need to look at your risk, look at a customer case-by-case basis and make the determination on a case-by-case basis. And with incorporating your own risk and controls to see how you can mitigate some of those potential concerns.
All right, so that I find this fascinating. So, all right, I got it. So blanket de-risking or blanket exiting, bad. But I do know that banks can do targeted, exiting. And Karen, I'm gonna go to you. I know that Wintrust does exit customers under some circumstances, right? And when you and I have talked about using risk assessment and AML policy sort of as a starting point to assess growing high-risk categories, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure, John. So yeah, Wintrust does use our AML policy as somewhat of a, launching for what type of customers might be considered to be too high risk for Wintrust. We try to stay ahead of it as far as, certain customer types or industry types of customers that we require bankers to reach out to our BSA department in order to ask those questions, as Jennifer alluded to, kind of taking those case by case to ensure that we're not banking a customer that may be too high of a risk for Wintrust's footprint and profile. But yeah, as you mentioned, also using kind of our risk assessment to keep tabs on what those emerging trends are and things that we are seeing across our banks. Again, Wintrust being somewhat unique in the footprint we have throughout the Chicagoland area, it's always something that helps us to understand our customer base, as well as a number of ongoing things that we are continually to do that I will mention later on in this session. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I find this topic fascinating, partly because there's so many high-risk categories that are emerging and becoming more prevalent. Everything from marijuana-related businesses, MRBs, casinos, other sort of online betting establishments. I could throw questions to the panel all day on this topic. Unfortunately, as I said, I've got to keep us tight and on agenda. So I'm going to move on to topic number 2. And topic number 2 is, really exploring this whole bit about, hot topics from regulators. We know that risk is a big one. What's the sort of next hot topic from regulators? And how can those of us in the industry prep for it? Ryan, let's start with you.
Thanks, John. I would say that one area that is a hot topic or will become a hot topic is going to be sports betting, particularly in the online space. With the pandemic and a lot of state governments, kind of squeeze for revenue, I think we're going to see a lot more state legislatures in the upcoming sessions push this a little harder from a revenue perspective. I was reading just this morning that actually Texas is now looking to push legislation to allow online sports betting. Really, online sports betting isn't dissimilar from actual regular physical casinos, and I'll explain that. So M&T does bank a few casinos in our portfolio and things like that, and it really is around to get a comfort level with those customers. It's really understanding the customer's transactions, which is really hard to get into with ACH or credit card activity. So it's really getting through maybe a questionnaire to that casino, or for example, understanding their KYC policies, how they verify identity, their transaction monitoring, their audit process, and what have you. Like I said, I think the online sports betting is going to be growing quickly into this year and into next year, and the regulators are probably taking a good look for it. And I would say, quite frankly, that institutions that are probably in that space already or are larger financial institutions probably have the risk tolerance and the infrastructure to support that and show to the regulators that they could support that. I don't want to be negative and say a small community bank couldn't do it, but the risk tolerance of your institution might be slightly different or a different space to start bringing on sports betting entities.
Ryan, I have a quick follow-up question, if you don't mind. So you mentioned that M&T does bank casinos, but what about banks that don't? How big of a sort of a jump or change is this if they decide to do so?
That's a good question. It really, I think, at an institutional level or at a fundamental level, it's making sure that senior management in both the lines of business, that it really fits your institution's risk appetite. Most banks, or all banks at this point, should have some sort of risk appetite statement. And if this type of, whether it's scoring methodology or how have you to determine that, and if it doesn't really fit into your appetite and the line of business is really pushing it, that's going to probably be a conversation with executive management, possibly the board, if they want to expand that risk appetite. If it does fit in your risk appetite statement, it's really having a really frank conversation with senior management around, do you have the tools and the infrastructure and the personnel to support and be able to effectively monitor this activity?
No, that makes sense. I want to go back and pick up something that Jennifer was talking about briefly, and that is, that regulators wanted to see procedures and controls. So I want to ask the entire panel, and anybody can chime in on this. How do banks demonstrate that they know what the risks are, procedures and controls in place? Anyone? Oh, I stumped. We're only 50 minutes in. I stumped everybody.
So I'll try to, start a conversation here. But I think what Jennifer said at the beginning of the conversation is having a good risk assessment process. So having a risk assessment process and understanding kind of your customer base and kind of from where your population potentially, banks or what type of customers you're bringing on, and understanding those risks is important. And quantifying it, right? So having kind of metrics in place to say, this is our metric and this is how we quantify that risk, and go back and support it with your data, whether it's data from SAR filings or data from potential exits of customers, that supports kind of your riskiest customer, right? In being able to really articulate that through your policy and procedures, through your controls and effectiveness, I think allows the regulators to say, yes, they have a good understanding. But one thing that I'll just also mention, just when we talk about just regulators and kind of the hot topics that are coming up, I think it's important to also understand, like, we have the AML Act 2020 that was just introduced. And in that, there was the national priority list, right? So, historically, we had the FFIEC manual where it says these are our high-risk customers. Now, with the AML Act 2020, there will be a national priority list based on their risk assessment that will come out. So I think it's also important to be able to take those feedbacks or those indicators from regulators and pivot within your current risk assessment.
Nice. Good answer. Anyone else want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, this is Jennifer. And then speaking of the risk assessment, it's just OCC has recommended on the fair access rule that is going to be coming into play in April, that we need to also look at customers on a customer basis and not just as a big grouping. And so if we can just, display that we know the risk of a certain customer type. And then I think what's important is we trust the customer, what they say, but then also we trust but verify. And so however your bank's process of doing that, checking governmental license, registrations, that could be especially important if you do decide that your bank's risk appetite is okay with banking marijuana-related businesses. But trust but verify. And so look at a customer by customer level, but as a bank, and then take those as a whole so that you can have a holistic picture of your risk assessment.
That's a great answer. Something else, and I want to carry on with this a little bit because, again, I sort of find this interesting. When I'm talking, I'm a sales guy, so I talk to bankers all day long, right? And so I hear the concerns. I hear what bankers are really worried about. And I do hear people talking about, okay, we're at the point now where I'm able to demonstrate to regulators what the risks are, and I'm able to demonstrate that I have controls in place. But the regulators want to know, they want to see metrics, right? They want to see how big is the risk? How does it compare to other risks? So has there been a recent focus on metrics? And if so, how are the banks dealing with it? Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, John, I'll take a stab at it. I would say that metrics have, always been there and things of that nature. And then, to your point, I'm sure everyone on the line has got a risk assessment policy and can show how many customers they have and things of that nature. So I don't want to say it's getting granular with the regulators, because honestly, sometimes giving more than is asked can get you inadvertently in trouble. But I think it's going beyond the top 2 pages and things like that, and actually showing them or demonstrating how you got from point A to point Z, and for example how your models work or how your transaction monitoring systems work and things of that nature. I think that both showing them the metrics, the output is good, but showing them, kind of a funnel effect, how you got to those metrics too, can give them a level of comfort that your output makes sense given the inputs.
Oh, great answer. Great answer. Anyone else want to chime in?
This is Jennifer. Yeah, I would say, and even going beyond just what your output is, a new regulatory trend has been looking at below the line testing. And so they're not wanting to see, what alerted and why. They're also wanting to see, well, what did you filter out? And was that filtering appropriate? If you can say we only had 20 alerts and we worked them and all was well, but, there was 200 that were filtered out because of X, Y, and Z. They want to know that filtering was appropriate and that they can trust the end result. So that's also, I think, a trend that regulators are looking at. Not only is our alert functioning as intended, but are we testing to see that any noise that didn't make it to an alert level? That is also something that we consider.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. That's a great point and a great elaboration. Again, we could explore this, I think, in detail and continue on, but I want to keep it moving. So I'm going to move on to topic number 3. And all this focus on metrics, all this discussion on risk and measurement, it brings to mind, at least for me, tools, right? And we're speaking the language of tools here when we talk about measurements and metrics. So I'd like to ask the panelists, what tools will the leading banks in the industry be using to cope with the growing problem, and for most of us, of course, that means growing alert volumes. Corey, let's start off with you.
Yeah, and thanks. I think that's a good question. So one thing I first would say, though, is that, the growing alert volumes is depending on kind of your institution, right? So I would take a step back to kind of say, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and kind of what's the root cause for the growing alert volume? So I'll give you an example. It may be because you have a new acquisition. Ideally, if you have a new acquisition, that will bring more customers in, so potentially more alert volumes. Or there may be changes in patterns of how you are onboarding customers, right? So you may be moving to more digital perspective versus kind of branch to branch. Or you may have changed vendors or have different kind of inputs into your model that's triggering different alerts. So I think it's very important that you do a root cause analysis to really understand that, because I think the first inclination that people have is when you see these growing alert volumes to throw staffing, and that's not always the right approach. I think there is a kind of need for staffing, but it's a combination of potentially looking at internally, do you have the right infrastructure in place to be able to manage the customer? Do you have the right infrastructure in place to get the information that you need to disposition alerts automatically, right? Are you internally utilizing AI, machine learning, to be able to kind of look at big data and to kind of identify the trends so that you can kind of close out some of those simpler alerts to say, and let your associates and resources focus on those more complicated alerts. And then, I mentioned kind of internal resources and internal kind of models, but, the question may also be, do I need to reach out to a third-party vendor? to get those in, get additional resources, get additional technology in to solve the solution. And with that, I think we also have to be prepared to understand that there are a lot of third-party solutions out there, but you have to make sure that it's right for your institution and also for your kind of risk tolerance and risk appetite. So when looking at third-party solutions, does it solve the problem I have? Does the algorithm is it transparent enough so that, I can look at how their special sauce is coming up with alerts? And then in some cases, you may find a vendor that's actually looking at things that you didn't look at before. So that's going to increase volume alerts. And that may be a good thing, right? Because you're identifying risks that you hadn't previously identified. So I know, Jennifer, you talked about that, 20 alerts may look good in some cases, but you really, if you go above the line or below the line, there may be cases where there's additional risk out there. And then just, internally, I think as, risk advisors and compliance advisors, I think we need to make sure that we are also integrating the processes together as a institution so that, when you are trying to solve these problems, you can rely on other information, whether it's internal or having, information that's available from just government sites or information that's available really on the web. Now, there are certain things that when you look at the problem of alert volumes, it may be operational in nature. And when you look at that is, do I have the right resources to solve this kind of process? And, a lot of times we may not. And that's also where you may bring consultants in place where they're helping you to solve that problem fast, to be bringing those fresh eyes, to bring in those fresh knowledge, to say, this is the overall problem. How can you get me to a place where it's more sustainable? And I think that is kind of the key in terms of tools. There's not a silver bullet in this. I wish there was, because I know for sure I would have probably chosen something like that. But it's going to be a combination of resources, internal resources, utilizing the right vendors that can help you kind of solve for the alerts, and also for your customer base. And then also just making sure you have efficient processes that are able to be changed, because a lot of times we build these processes that are not nimble enough to be able to kind of adapt to changes in regulation, adapt to changes in kind of risk scoring or modeling. So that's very important when we look at kind of tools that you use when you're trying to cope with these alert volumes.
Correct. It's a great answer. And, I especially appreciate that shout out, to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Speaking as an AI sales guy to the other panelists, I don't want to show favoritism, but right now Corey's my favorite panelist. Just going to throw that out there. For everybody else, I want to ask a few quick follow-up questions. Ryan, you and I have talked about. You had suggested when we talked earlier staff augmentation. You guys had some success at M&T using staff augmentation as a tool. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thanks, John. For a few years now, within our BSA ML space, we've utilized a firm that pretty much solely focuses on BSA AML activities, and we have folks from their staff that perform enhanced due diligence reviews, transaction monitoring reviews, and what have you, and that's helped us kind of, where we had the, kind of the peaks and things like that, where we don't really, we see what we forecast what we got coming in for the year, and things like that. And it makes sense to have, maybe not additional FTs on hand, but just to kind of augment the staff. And as things ramp up or we get a spike, maybe, we tweak the scenario, or we got a bunch of new customers and the volumes go up, we can basically turn that pipeline on and, bring on, based on the contract, a bunch of analysts. And I think for firms on the line that are interested in that, besides, going to those websites and getting the glossy brochures, and if you're really serious about it, is really get from those potential firms some contacts from other, banks that they've worked with, and talk to the BSA officer, somebody at that bank, or you may know somebody, and really understand what works and what didn't work and things of that nature. Just really get a good feel for that's something you want to do.
Thank you. Jennifer, follow-up question for you. When you and I talked on this topic a while back, you gave, I thought, a very eloquent sort of summation of maybe banks should start focusing on high value SARs. I didn't ask you at the time, but what the heck is a high value SAR?
Well, there are certain types of transactions that you just aren't going to get a whole bevy of information for. One example would be cash structuring. A lot of those transactions that you get, it's the customer made a deposit that appears structured, and for this reason, we're filing a SAR. That information isn't highly informative or beneficial to law enforcement. Now, if there's a pattern, it may be, but SARs and alerts that there could be some narrative for, is what law enforcement is looking for. That doesn't absolve you for doing SARs on those lower value, but that's maybe where you can use AI to help with those volumes instead of just throwing people, is if you can find a way to kind of get a standardized narrative and talk to your regulators. If you have a good relationship with them, some of these projects, throw it out to your regulators and say, this is what we're doing. This is the way we're going. And they'll be happy to give you feedback. So just, establish your relationships with them. But in our case, they have been receptive to some of that because they want to see the analysts at the bank really dissect and get to know our customers and prove that when we do our narratives, that those narratives are very instrumental to law enforcement to do what they need to do versus ones where they might not get as much information just because of the nature of the transaction.
Thank you. And thank you for the second shout out to AI. I know for everyone else, I now have two favorite panelists. I'm going to throw that out there. I think we're a little past the halfway point. I think it's time for another poll question. Brian, back to you. Let's keep the audience on their toes.
Great. Thanks, John. The question here is, going into 2021, how can we as an industry be more effective in fighting financial crime? And I think this actually segues really nicely with the discussion around high-value SARs and producing high-value SARs. That was one of the points highlighted in the recent AML Act of 2020, actually really emphasizing producing highly useful intelligence for law enforcement within that legislation. So definitely an area of focus. Public-private partnerships is another big area. The use of tech is another area, simply staffing up. Or do we need to do everything at the same time or something else? And if it's something else, if your answer is other, we'd love to hear about it in the Q&A. So feel free to type a response, outside of these options into that Q&A. And let us know, what it would take to do better. So we'll leave this up for maybe about 10 more seconds. And just because I saw the question come in, certificates of participation will be available if you're an ACFCS member within 3 business days of this presentation. That will be available in our learning portal. Log in and look for your certificate. There's a button that says view my certificate or view my completion. I forget what it says, but something along those lines, you'll find it there. All right, so choose now if you haven't already, and let's see the results. Going into 2021, how can we as an industry be more effective in fighting financial crime? About 25% of you say improve information sharing between banks and law enforcement. The most popular answer, maybe unsurprisingly, was all of the above. So for our compliance folks out there, just do all of it. And then technology is the second one. Overhauling the existing framework, not necessarily very popular, and looks like most of you don't think simply just kind of ramping up the people is necessarily the way to go. So I'll turn it back to you, John, and any thoughts on those results.
Thank you, Brian. In fact, I am fascinated by these results. I'm going to move on, in fact, to the fourth topic, which is exactly the same as this question. We're at about the 40-minute mark, so let's, we got about 5 to 6 minutes left in the program portion of the panel. This topic really did grow out of a conversation with a woman named Georgie Kostema. She's a BSA officer over at MidFirst Bank. I've had some. I know that many of our panelists know Georgie. Many of our distinguished panelists have worked with her. Georgie did know a while back that maybe the hottest topic today is a very simple question. How can the industry be more effective at what the Bank Secrecy Act was designed to do 50 years ago, back in 1970, and that's actually catch financial criminals. Georgie asked me at one point, she said, aside from waiting for regulatory changes, just what are some of the practical ways the industry can be more effective at knowing their customers and performing enhanced due diligence? So that has become our fourth topic. So Karen, I'd like to start with you. How can the industry become more effective at fighting financial crime?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think there's a number of different ways that a bank can become more effective fighting financial crimes. But, one thing that we've done that's worked well with us is that, the financial crime isn't just about the BSA department fighting financial crimes. It's also, your front lines, it's your back office workers, kind of including all of them in those kind of regulation changes, informing them when something is big that's coming out that's new, getting kind of input and impact of how it may, involve their areas as well. So that's one. The other thing we've talked about, already touched on some of this, is, kind of the metrics behind the customers. So beyond just who your high-risk customers are, but, taking different category types and looking for those emerging trends in your financial institutions and really understanding that. Some of the things that we like to do for my team in the EDD world, is kind of building on then the team itself, providing them with some additional tools or resources to become kind of the subject matter experts in different in the different industry types. So we develop checklists and things like that, that might be involving different research projects for those individuals so that they can kind of be the go-to for certain industry types. So that's really helped us in a number of ways.
Karen, you've also talked about working with your team. And when you and I talked about a couple weeks before Christmas, you talked about building an effective program, sort of by investing in employees to make them, genuine financial crime professionals. That really struck me at the time as what a great aspiration. Can you elaborate a little bit on what goes on in Wintrust to sort of augment that?
Sure. So I think attending things like this, different certification programs, getting involved in local chapter events, things of that nature have all really been useful to provide those individuals with the different tools and skill sets that may help them as, a more well-rounded financial crimes expert. Other things that we do, we do have opportunities where we might have some cross-training within our different teams so that it really understands from an enhanced due diligence perspective how those, transaction monitoring alerts are working, how the investigations, how it's all impacting the different areas of our financial institution. So really just, continuing to build on those employees that you do have and their skill set, and also those new coming into the bank as well.
Karen, how do you build a compliance culture at the bank? I mean, not just amongst the team, but sort of across the whole organization.
Well, a number of different ways. I think through constant communications, we send out a lot of different information about compliance changes or different things of that nature to the front line so that you're including all of those individuals. Also, the understanding from like kind of a senior management level as well, kind of what the challenges are within the bank, expressing those things when you do need to go to senior management for possibly a new tool or something that might enhance your financial crimes, efficiencies. So having that understanding from the top down is really important as well, and communicating that throughout your organization.
Fantastic. We're right about at the 45-minute mark. Any final comments from the panelists before we jump into the Q&A?
Go ahead, John.
All right, fantastic. All right, so it sounds like everybody's anxious to get into the Q&A. Working steadily behind the scenes here is the ACFCS team and Shayna Schneider on the Silent 8 crew to sort through some of these questions. I have one here from Gabrielle Griffin at Tompkins Financial, and she says 100% agree with Karen. A lot of the financial crime fighting falls on the laps of the BSA department, and the salespeople are left secondary, while their responsibilities are even more important. I can see if I can't scroll down here in fighting financial crime. Any comment on that? This looks. I don't see a question. It seems like it's more of a comment, but it's obviously focusing on the team individuals. Any comments?
I have a comment. One way to mitigate that is to get buy-in from those different lines of businesses. At Wells Fargo, we actually set up a sanctions and anti-money laundering program where those lines of businesses send their representatives. They nominate them and go through a credentials program and have a test, and then are mentored by those in senior leadership and those in those positions. And that's one way to make sure that not only you're getting them information, but you're getting buy-in and getting them involved, and then they have something to show for it at the end. So that's something that other places could emulate or do something likewise. But it just gives people, a way to feel connected as how they can plug the issues in fighting financial crimes into their business line as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. So I do think it's a great partnership with the first line, but also ensuring that there's an understanding that it is not only the second line that owns it, it's actually the first line. So like Karen said, right? So like when you are collecting that information, when you are observing the customer, you are actually doing annual activities. So I think, making sure that they understand kind of the risk of not owning it, right? Because there is a potential risk, right? So you think about fines and increasing fines of non-adherence, because if it is solely falls on the second line to perform these activities, you won't be successful because you're only looking at after the fact. You aren't, and you're always running to put out fires and mitigate risks, not proactively manage them.
I agree with Corey. If I could just add, John,
good answer.
I would say tone from the top. I would say the tone from the top, that's where it starts. Having a culture of compliance, and, to the person's question about, the front lines, understanding those priorities, it really is a tone from the top, and making sure that tone echoes down through senior and middle management to make sure those sales people on the front line really understand that compliance is the responsibility of everyone in the institution, not just BSA AML. Everyone, has a responsibility in any bank to ensure that, we're not, facilitating illicit activities and things like that. So that kind of tone from the top is a good place to start.
Good answers. Questions are flooding in, and we're not going to be able to get to them all, but we're going to try and cover as many as we can. I have a question here from Allison Hines Pearl. How do you think the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act will impact banks?
That's a good question. I think time will tell on that one, not to give a non-answer, but I think it's all going to be around how is it implemented in terms of regulation, and how do the regulators implement it, and then how do the regulators come in and actually test or test banks or examine banks. So I think that's probably, in my opinion at least, there's probably a lot of what ifs right now, and until we start to see regulation out for the public comment, that box is pretty big.
Okay. Another question here from Jeannie Whalen. How do we deal with what appear to be fraudulent state unemployment COVID payments when we suspect fraud, but we haven't yet been contacted by the state government entities that we have identified fraud? This may be more fraud than sort of AML and KYC. Anybody want to take that, though?
This is where partnerships with your state and your local regulators are very important. Wells Fargo obviously is a big bank and had quite an uptick of COVID-related fraud during the year. And through conversations with our regulators, we were able to kind of put them all together into a typology SARS. And so then when they would see the reporting, instead of 18,000 SARS on customer by customer, we were able to kind of group them together. But conversations with your state and local regulators is vital, because the volume is going to keep going up, provided everyone's going to a digital world, and with payment technologies like Zelle and Cash App and Venmo, it's gonna just keep growing. And so having an open conversation with your regulators and integrating AI, as well as seeing how you can use innovation while still satisfying your reporting requirements, is going to be crucial.
Good answer. I'll move on quickly to the next question. This one's from Dovo Baturiel, from the Bank of Lithuania. How can small financial institutions remain competitive in the environment of growing regulation and growing scrutiny? Can big banks have a role in a knowledge sharing or knowledge exchange here? I think it's a great question. Anyone want to take that one?
Don, it's Karen. I think one way, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, is to continue to have forums like this, being involved with different banks of different sizes, and kind of finding those peer groups where you can ask questions to each other, and how banks are doing that to kind of keep, yourselves competitive in that market space. For sure, for smaller banks, I think is very important.
I think that's a good answer, and that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, events like this, where folks from some large organizations can get on and share their information, is one way to do it, and there are certainly other fashions as well. I have a question from Victor Fernandez, who is not affiliated with a bank. He lists his association as Job Seeker, but I like this question. He says, "Hi, I'm looking forward to pursuing a career as a BSA or AML officer. What advice does the panel offer me?"
So I would say, you've started the path there, right? Because you've started kind of your education path there. So I would say, create a plan where, like, you have the right learning in place. Or do you have the right certifications? Do you have kind of things that will get you in the door? Because I think that's the first thing, having knowledge, skill sets, and transferable skills that will get you in the door. And then once you get in the door, is being able to really apply yourself and understand kind of the end-to-end process. So I know, Karen, you talked about, making sure that, if you're in EDD, you understand the full end-to-end KYC or full just customer process, right? How do I impact other areas? So I think once you do that well and you understand how you impact other areas, that makes you kind of more knowledgeable. And as you get more experience, I think obviously you continue to grow. So, there's not one right answer to this. People have different paths and kind of journeys in getting there. But I do think it does start with kind of learning and kind of understanding the landscape that you're getting into, and then getting a foot in the door and then showing kind of your skill sets and going from there.
Good answer. Good answer.
One of my favorite quotes too on that is a quote by Ben Franklin that said, "An investment in education pays the greatest dividends." And so I would say just continue to invest in yourself via education. Learn what you can, do those community chapter events, and that will pay off twofold. You'll get the education, but then you'll also meet contacts. And I found that AML, the BSA AML financial crime field is a relatively small field, and if you've shown that you're willing to learn and you're willing to work and educate yourself and be on the front lines, you will have success.
Good answer. Good answer. Question here from Zach Mario from Schultz Consulting. How important is negative news or adverse media when screening to risk negative news or adverse media screening to risk screening programs?
it's very important to have a negative news component integrated into your screening, whether that be as a case by case, if a negative news, that would be provide an alert that you can disposition it. But there are examples of negative news that have, came out on customers that banks have willfully not acted upon and are now being asked to pay fines for doing so. And so to have negative news, a component in your screening, is very, very important.
Yeah,
I agree. And I would add to that as well, is that consider the source, or know your source of the negative news. Is it, the Financial Times or the New York Times, or is it, and I'll quote the Simpsons here, is it Grandpa Simpson yelling at the cloud, on their blog. So, when you do your Google searches, really look at, where's that information coming from as well? Is it a reputable source? Is it social media? And weigh that as well.
Great point. We are coming up on the 56-minute mark, so I think we're just going to do one final question. And this one is from Hugo Viazzi at RDC. Any thoughts from the panel about determining the source of wealth or funds in the KYC process?
Karen, EDD background, do you have anything?
Yeah.
You'd be perfect.
Yeah, no, I think, as far as determining the source of the funds for a customer is something that we always take into account in the EDD world. Taking what the customer tells us at the onboarding, but then also looking at those transactions that are actually occurring. Matching it up, does it make sense? Does it make sense with this type of industry? But also, for an individual, taking that person's occupation and that source of funds and matching it up just to ensure that what we're seeing, is it in fact what that true source of funds is. So, and then further determining, different things as we've talked about, Google searches and things like that might help you kind of substantiate the actual information that you're getting, including negative news, as we just mentioned.
Thank you, Karen. That is terrific. I think we are just about at the 2-minute wrap-up point, so I am going to. I could keep reading these questions all day, and I certainly could keep chatting with our panelists all day, but the world won't let us do that. So we're going to have to bring it to a close here. I'd love to thank all of the panelists for their time and for all the prep work that they put into it in advance. Brian, at this point, I'd like to pass it back to you. I think you might have one final wrap-up poll question.
Yeah, I just threw a poll question up at the end of the conversation here, so please go ahead and respond to it if you haven't had a chance to, and we'll, in just about 5 seconds, we'll look at the results. So hit that submit button now, and let's see where you're at. Looks like the number one is new transaction monitoring tools people are considering for the new year, and then close second is AI. So, John, looks like they're going to keep you busy.
They're all my favorites. All those people in my audience are my favorites.
So yeah, definite interest out there in a variety of tools, particularly transaction monitoring and AI. So thanks again for an excellent panel discussion. Again, if you want to receive, we'll share the poll results from this session with those that opt in, as well as some additional resources. So if you want to receive those, please do click yes on the current survey question. Again, if you're an ACFCS member, be on the lookout for the email when this is posted to the site. You will be able to watch the recording, access the resources, and access your certificate of participation on our learning portal. You'll find that on our site, acfcs.org. Log in with your credentials, and the recording and certificate will be there. And finally, please join us again, as mentioned, next week. Just a few days away is our Back to the Future of FinCrime event. And really looking forward to that one. Should be a lot of fun. And as mentioned, Silent8 is involved in that event too. So definitely join us next week, fincrimeevent.com, if you have not already registered. Entirely complimentary, 4 days of learning and networking. If you can't make it to that, we have webinars all the time. We have another one coming up tomorrow. on the state of ransomware in 2020. And beyond that, we have ones in February. A lot of fun stuff coming up. So visit our website, join us again for a future session, and please consider joining us for the Back to the Future of Fin Crime event. Sincere thanks again to all the panelists for a lively and fascinating discussion. Great moderation by John, as always. And thanks again to Selenate for putting this on. And thanks again to a lovely audience who asked some really excellent questions. Please do fill out that survey. Let us know your thoughts, feedback, and future topics. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a great afternoon and a great rest of the day. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Brian.